Sarah Miller couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her stomach as she drove to her son Ryan's elementary school that Tuesday afternoon. As a single mother working 2 jobs, she rarely had the chance to surprise her 8-year-old during lunch break. But that day was different. She had managed to get off work early and wanted to make her son's day special. The school hallways were quiet except for the distant chatter and laughter coming from the cafeteria. As she approached the large double doors, memories of her own school days flooded back. The familiar smell of cafeteria food brought a smile to her face, but that smile quickly faded when she peered through the small window in the door. What she witnessed made her blood run cold. Her son's teacher, Mrs. Thompson, was standing over Ryan's table, removing items from his carefully packed lunchbox. Other students watched in silence as the teacher placed Ryan's homemade sandwich and fruit cup into a paper bag, replacing them with a standard cafeteria meal. Sarah's hands trembled as she pushed open the heavy doors. The bustling cafeteria seemed to fall silent as she walked purposefully toward her son's table. Ryan's face lit up for a moment when he saw his mother, but his expression quickly changed to one of embarrassment and worry. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the anger building inside her. "May I ask why you're removing my son's lunch?" Mrs. Thompson straightened up, clutching the paper bag containing Ryan's homemade lunch. "Oh, Mrs. Miller. I wasn't expecting you." She glanced around nervously before continuing. "We've implemented new nutritional guidelines, and I'm afraid your son's lunch doesn't meet our standards." Sarah looked at the cafeteria meal that had replaced her carefully prepared lunch, a processed chicken sandwich, canned fruit in heavy syrup, and chocolate milk. Her mind went to the fresh turkey sandwich with whole grain bread, organic apple slices, and homemade trail mix she had packed that morning before dawn. "Are you telling me that processed food is healthier than the fresh lunch I prepared?" Sarah asked, conscious of the other children watching the exchange. She had worked extra shifts at the diner to afford better quality food for Ryan, determined to give him the healthy start she never had. The teacher shifted uncomfortably. "The district has specific requirements. Requirements that include throwing away perfectly good food?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising slightly. She noticed Ryan shrinking in his seat, and immediately modulated her tone. This wasn't just about the lunch anymore, it was about dignity and respect. Other parents in the cafeteria began to take notice of the exchange. A few pulled out their phones, while others whispered among themselves. Sarah knew this moment could either become a viral spectacle or a chance for positive change. Taking a deep breath, she turned to address the teacher more calmly. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand you're following protocol, but there's something fundamentally wrong when we waste good food and replace it with processed alternatives. More importantly, how do you think this makes the children feel?" The teacher's face flushed as she looked around at the students, many of whom were watching intently. Some nodded in agreement with Sarah's words, while others stared at their own lunches uncertainly. Ryan finally spoke up, his voice small but clear. "Mom always packs healthy stuff. She teaches me about nutrition and we even grow some vegetables in our community garden plot." Sarah's heart swelled with pride at her son's words. She hadn't known he paid such close attention to their weekend gardening lessons. The other children at the table began to chime in, sharing stories about their own packed lunches and family food traditions. What started as a confrontation was transforming into an impromptu discussion about healthy eating and food choices. Sarah noticed the school principal hovering nearby, listening intently to the conversation. "Perhaps," Sarah suggested, meeting the principal's eyes, "we could turn this into a learning opportunity. Instead of removing food from children's lunchboxes, we could create a program where parents and teachers work together to develop nutritional guidelines that make sense for everyone." The principal stepped forward, introducing himself to the growing crowd of interested parents who had gathered nearby. "Mrs. Miller raises some excellent points," he acknowledged. "We should review our policies and ensure they truly serve our students' best interests." As the lunch period drew to a close, Sarah helped Ryan pack up his belongings, making sure he got back both his original lunch and the cafeteria meal. No sense in wasting food, after all. The other parents approached her, sharing their own stories and concerns about the school's lunch policies. What could have been a heated confrontation had instead sparked an important conversation about nutrition, respect, and community involvement in school policies. Sarah exchanged contact information with several other parents, all eager to work together on improving the school's approach to student nutrition. On the drive home that evening, Ryan was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke up. "Mom, I'm proud of how you handled that today. You didn't yell or get super angry like some parents do. You made it better for everyone." Sarah felt tears prick at her corners of her eyes. "Sometimes, honey, the best way to fight for what's right is to find common ground and work together for change." The story of what happened in the cafeteria that day spread quickly through the community. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon other schools in the district began reviewing their own lunch policies. Sarah found herself at the center of a movement to improve school nutrition programs while respecting family choices and reducing food waste. But more importantly, she had taught her son a valuable lesson about standing up for what's right while maintaining dignity and respect for others. The incident that began with outrage ended with hope for positive change, proving that sometimes the most challenging moments can lead to the most meaningful improvements in a community. As Sarah tucked Ryan into bed that night, she reflected on how a simple decision to surprise her son at lunch had turned into something much bigger. It reminded her that one person's actions, when guided by compassion and determination, could spark meaningful change that benefits everyone. The following weeks brought unexpected changes to Riverside Elementary School. What began as a single mother's stand in the cafeteria had evolved into a community-wide movement for better school nutrition policies. Sarah found herself juggling her regular work shifts with evening meetings, where parents and school administrators gathered to discuss meaningful changes. One evening, as Sarah sat at her kitchen table reviewing proposals for the new lunch guidelines, Ryan approached with 2 cups of chamomile tea, their nightly ritual. "Mom, Tommy from my class said his parents are talking about you at dinner. He said you're like a superhero, but instead of fighting bad guys, you fight for better food." Sarah couldn't help but chuckle at the comparison. She thought back to her own childhood, when her mother had worked long hours at a factory, relying on quick, processed meals to feed the family. It had fueled her determination to provide better options for Ryan, despite their tight budget. The school board meeting was scheduled for the following evening. Sarah had spent weeks gathering signatures, researching nutrition guidelines, and working with other parents to develop a comprehensive proposal. As she ironed her best blazer, the one she saved for special occasions, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Mrs. Thompson, Ryan's teacher. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she answered. Their relationship had been tense since the cafeteria incident, though they had maintained professional courtesy for Ryan's sake. "Mrs. Miller," the teacher's voice was softer than usual. "I've been doing some thinking. That day in the cafeteria, I was wrong. I was so focused on following rules that I forgot to consider the human impact of my actions. I'd like to speak at tomorrow's board meeting, if you'll have me." Sarah sank into her favorite armchair, touched by the teacher's honesty. "That would mean a lot, Mrs. Thompson. This isn't about pointing fingers, it's about creating positive change for all our kids." The board meeting room was packed the next evening. Parents, teachers, and even some students filled every available seat. Sarah noticed several local news cameras setting up in the back. Her palms were sweaty as she clutched her presentation materials. Ryan sat in the front row with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had insisted on coming to show her support. She had been helping Sarah tend their community garden plot since Ryan was a toddler, teaching them both about traditional Chinese vegetables and herbs. As Sarah stood at the podium, she saw countless familiar faces. There was Mr. Rodriguez, whose food truck had catered their first parent-teacher meeting about nutrition. Next to him sat Dr. Patel, a local pediatrician who had volunteered her expertise in developing age-appropriate nutrition guidelines. 3 weeks ago, Sarah began, her voice clear and steady, I walked into my son's school cafeteria and witnessed something that disturbed me deeply. But tonight, I'm not here to dwell on that moment. I'm here to talk about solutions. She outlined their proposal, a collaborative approach to school nutrition that respected both federal guidelines and family choices. They suggested incorporating nutrition education into the curriculum, establishing a school garden program, and creating a parent-teacher committee to oversee lunch policies. When Mrs. Thompson took the podium, her words brought tears to many eyes. She shared her own journey of realizing how the rigid enforcement of rules had overshadowed the real purpose of education, nurturing healthy, confident children. The school board listened intently as parent after parent shared their stories. A single father spoke about his struggles to provide healthy meals while working night shifts. A grandmother talked about passing down traditional family recipes through packed lunches. A local farmer offered to supply fresh produce to the school at reduced rates. As the meeting drew to a close, the board chairman cleared his throat. It's rare to see such a united community effort, he said. We'll need time to review all the proposals in detail, but I think I speak for the entire board when I say that change is coming to Riverside Elementary. The crowd erupted in applause. Ryan ran to his mother, wrapping his arms around her waist. See, Mom? Just like a superhero. Later that night, as Sarah checked on a sleeping Ryan, she noticed something on his desk. It was a drawing of her, standing tall in the cafeteria, but instead of a cape, she wore an apron decorated with fruits and vegetables. The caption read, My mom, fighting for good food and happy kids. The next morning, Sarah's phone was flooded with messages. Other schools in the district wanted to learn about their proposed changes. A local organic market offered to start a school donation program. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled, Mothers Stand Against Food Waste Sparks Community Revolution. But the most meaningful change was happening right at home. Ryan had started showing interest in cooking, asking to help pack his own lunches. Other kids at school were bringing in their family recipes to share. The cafeteria, once a place of tension, was becoming a space for cultural exchange and learning. Mrs. Thompson had transformed too. She started a classroom herb garden, teaching students about the connection between growing food and healthy eating. The kids took turns caring for the plants, beaming with pride as their tiny seeds sprouted into fragrant basil and mint. Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how one moment of standing up for what she believed in had created ripples throughout the community. It wasn't just about school lunches anymore, it was about dignity, respect, and the power of working together for positive change. As she prepared for another day at work, Sarah glanced at the growing stack of letters on her counter, messages from parents across the district sharing their own stories and asking for advice. She smiled, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions, like a mother walking into her son's school cafeteria on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The journey was far from over, but Sarah knew that with the support of her community, anything was possible. After all, real change doesn't happen overnight, it grows slowly, like the vegetables in their community garden, nurtured by many hands working together toward a common goal. The success at Riverside Elementary caught the attention of district officials, and Sarah soon found herself invited to speak at a regional education conference. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, practicing her presentation, she could hardly believe how much had changed in just 2 months. Ryan poked his head into the bathroom, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Mom, can I come to the conference too? I want to tell them about our new lunch trading program. The pride in his voice made Sarah's heart swell. The students had started a supervised lunch exchange program where they could share traditional family dishes, turning mealtimes into cultural learning experiences. Of course you can, sweetie, Sarah replied, adjusting her name tag. Your story is just as important as mine." She remembered how her shy little boy had gradually found his voice through all of this, becoming a passionate advocate for healthy eating among his peers. The conference center was intimidating, all glass and steel, filled with education professionals in suits and blazers. Sarah felt out of place in her best department store outfit, but Ryan squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You look like a real food superhero, Mom," he whispered, making her smile. During the morning session, Sarah listened to other speakers discuss various educational initiatives. Many seemed disconnected from the daily realities of working families. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath and decided to speak from the heart rather than her prepared notes. 2 months ago, I was just a mom trying to give my son healthy lunches on a tight budget, she began. Today, I'm here to tell you about how our community transformed a moment of conflict into an opportunity for positive change. As she shared their story, Sarah could see heads nodding throughout the audience. She talked about their community garden program, where students now spent time learning about growing food. She described how local businesses had joined in, with farmers offering fresh produce and chefs volunteering to teach cooking classes. Ryan joined her on stage to explain the student-led initiatives. "We don't just eat lunch anymore," he said, his voice clear and confident. "We share stories about our families and learn about different cultures through food. Last week, my friend taught me about his grandmother's special rice recipe, and I showed him how to make my mom's healthy trail mix." The audience's response was overwhelming. Administrators from other districts asked about implementing similar programs. Local news stations requested interviews. But what touched Sarah most was the line of parents waiting to speak with her after the presentation, each with their own story about struggling to provide healthy meals while working long hours. One mother, fighting back tears, shared how her daughter had been teased for bringing traditional Indian lunches to school. "Your program could change that," she said. "It could make differences something to celebrate rather than shame." The drive home from the conference was quiet as Sarah processed everything. Ryan had fallen asleep in the back seat, clutching the certificate of appreciation the conference organizers had given him. She thought about how far they'd come from that tense moment in the cafeteria. The next morning, Sarah's phone rang early. It was the district superintendent, asking if she would consider heading a new initiative to implement similar programs across all district schools. The position would mean leaving her current jobs, but it came with a salary that could support her family while allowing her to pursue this important work. "I'll need time to think about it," Sarah said, watching Ryan prepare his lunch for school. He was carefully packing the leftover vegetable stir-fry they'd made together the night before, along with fresh fruit and his favorite whole-grain crackers. That evening, she called a community meeting at Riverside Elementary to discuss the opportunity. The cafeteria, the same one where everything had started, was filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Thompson sat next to Mrs. Chen, sharing a plate of homemade dumplings. Mr. Rodriguez's kids played with Dr. Patel's daughter near the vegetable garden they'd planted together. "I want your honest opinions," Sarah told the group. "This would affect all of you too. We started this journey together, and I won't make this decision alone." The discussion lasted for hours. Parents shared their hopes for expanding the program, teachers offered suggestions for curriculum integration, and even the cafeteria staff contributed ideas for implementation. The children, allowed to stay up late for this special meeting, drew pictures of their dream school lunch programs. As Sarah looked around the room, she realized something important. What had begun as her standing up for her son had become something much bigger. It had become a movement owned by the entire community. Each person in that room had contributed to its success, had added their own unique perspective and talents. Later that night, as she tucked Ryan into bed, he asked, "Mom, are you going to take the new job?" Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his hair. "What do you think I should do?" He thought for a moment, then said, "Remember when you told me that sometimes the best way to fight for what's right is to work together? Maybe this is a chance to help more kids and families work together." The wisdom in his simple words struck her. Tomorrow, she would accept the position, but with one condition, that the program remain community-driven, with input from parents, teachers, and students at every school. As she closed Ryan's door, Sarah smiled, thinking about how life's biggest changes often start with the smallest moments of courage. From a concerned mother's intervention in a school cafeteria had grown a movement that was now poised to transform an entire school district's approach to nutrition and community engagement. The journey ahead would bring new challenges, but Sarah knew she wouldn't face them alone. She had a community behind her, united in the belief that every child deserved not just healthy food, but also respect, dignity, and the chance to learn from one another's traditions and experiences. 6 months into her new role as District Nutrition and Community Engagement Coordinator, Sarah found herself facing an unexpected challenge. The success of Riverside Elementary's program had attracted attention from state education officials, but with it came increased scrutiny and pressure to standardize the approach across all schools. One rainy morning, as Sarah reviewed emails in her small district office, she received an urgent message from the State Department of Education. They wanted to audit the program, concerned that the community-driven approach might not meet all state requirements. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the detailed list of regulations they planned to review. "Mom, you're doing that worried face again," Ryan said from the doorway of her office. It was Saturday, and he had accompanied her to work while she caught up on paperwork. Now 10 years old, he had become remarkably perceptive about her moods. "Just some new challenges, sweetie," she replied, trying to sound upbeat. "Remember how we talked about good changes sometimes being hard?" She thought back to their community meeting the previous evening at Pine Grove Elementary, the 5th school to implement their program. The excitement in the room had been palpable as parents shared traditional recipes and teachers reported improved student engagement. A grandfather had tears in his eyes as he described how proud his grandson was to finally share his family's Puerto Rican dishes with classmates. The phone on her desk rang. It was Mrs. Thompson, who had become one of the program's strongest advocates. "Sarah, I just heard about the audit. The Teachers Association wants to help. We've documented everything, the improved attendance rates, better classroom focus, even fewer visits to the school nurse." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude. The program had not only transformed school nutrition but had also built a network of support that extended far beyond cafeteria walls. She thought of Mr. Rodriguez, who now supplied fresh produce to 3 school cafeterias through his expanded business, and Dr. Patel, who had developed a curriculum linking nutrition education to science standards. That afternoon, Sarah called an emergency meeting of the district's new Food and Community Council. As parents, teachers, and administrators filed into the conference room, she saw determination on their faces. These were people who had witnessed firsthand the power of community-driven change. "The state audit could change everything," Sarah explained, her voice steady despite her concerns. "They might try to replace our flexible, community-based approach with standardized guidelines." A new parent spoke up from the back of the room. "My daughter just started at Riverside this year. She has severe food allergies, and for the first time, she feels safe and included at lunch. We can't let them take that away." Others shared similar stories, of children trying new foods, of families connecting through shared meals, of improved relationships between schools and communities. The room buzzed with energy as they brainstormed ways to demonstrate the program's impact. Ryan, who had been quietly drawing in the corner, suddenly stood up. "Why don't we invite them to lunch?" he suggested. "Not just one lunch, but lots of lunches at different schools. Let them see what it's really like." The simplicity and brilliance of his suggestion left the room silent for a moment before erupting in enthusiastic agreement. They would show rather than tell, let the state officials experience the program firsthand. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and her team prepared for the audit. They gathered data on attendance rates, academic performance, and student health indicators. But more importantly, they organized a series of lunch visits across the district. The first state officials arrived on a bright Tuesday morning. They came armed with clipboards and checklists, their faces serious as they began their inspection. But as they moved from school to school, something began to change. At Riverside Elementary, they watched as students tended the school garden before lunch, learning about plant science while harvesting vegetables for the day's salad bar. In the cafeteria, they saw children confidently reading nutrition labels and making informed choices about their meals. At Pine Grove Elementary, they joined a classroom where parents were teaching students about measuring and fractions through family recipes. The joy and engagement were impossible to ignore as children practiced math skills while preparing healthy snacks. By the time they reached the last school on their tour, the officials' notepads were filled not just with compliance checks, but with questions about implementing similar programs in other districts. One official admitted that she had never seen such enthusiasm for school lunch programs in her 20 years of experience. The final meeting with the State Department was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Sarah stood before the board, surrounded by supporters from across the district. She had prepared a detailed presentation, but instead, she simply said, "I'd like you to hear directly from our community." For the next hour, parents, teachers, students, and community partners shared their experiences. They spoke of renewed connection to their cultural heritage, of children excited about healthy eating, of stronger community bonds. When the board chairwoman finally spoke, her words brought tears to many eyes. "We came here concerned about compliance," she said. "But what we've seen is a model for how education should work, with communities leading the way. Rather than requiring you to change, we want to learn from your success." As the room erupted in celebration, Sarah felt Ryan's arms wrap around her waist. "See, Mom," he whispered. "Sometimes you just have to let people see the good things for themselves." Walking home that evening, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come from that first confrontation in the school cafeteria. What had started as a mother's instinct to protect her child had grown into something that was protecting and nurturing an entire community. The next morning's newspaper headline read, "Revolutionary School Food Program Becomes State Model." But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't in the headlines, it was in the daily sight of children and families growing, learning, and sharing together, one meal at a time. Winter arrived, bringing new challenges and opportunities to the growing program. One frosty morning, Sarah received an urgent call from the kitchen staff at Riverside Elementary. The overnight storm had knocked out power to several schools in the district, including their central food storage facility. With hundreds of children expected for lunch, they faced a potential crisis. Sarah pulled into the school parking lot just as the sun was rising, her mind racing with possible solutions. The backup generators could only power essential equipment, and they had less than 5 hours until lunch service began. As she hurried toward the building, she nearly collided with Mrs. Chen, who was carrying several large thermal containers. "I heard about the power outage on the morning news," the elderly woman explained, steam rising from the containers. "I made hot soup, enough for at least 2 classes. Others are coming too." True to Mrs. Chen's words, a steady stream of parents and community members began arriving at the school. Mr. Rodriguez pulled up in his food truck, offering to keep perishables cold. Dr. Patel's husband, who owned a local restaurant, arrived with large containers of rice and vegetable curry. The school's entrance soon resembled an impromptu food festival. Inside the cafeteria, kitchen staff worked alongside parent volunteers, organizing the incoming food donations and setting up serving stations. Someone had brought portable camping stoves, safely supervised by the school's science teacher, to keep soups and stews warm. The crisis was transforming into an unexpected celebration of community spirit. "Mom, this is even better than regular lunch," Ryan exclaimed as he helped arrange containers of fresh fruit donated by the local grocery store. Other students had joined in too, proud to be part of the solution rather than just watching from the sidelines. The superintendent arrived, expecting to find a chaotic situation. Instead, she witnessed an orderly, creative response to the emergency. Children were learning about food safety from the kitchen staff, practicing math as they helped portion servings, and writing thank you notes to the community members who had stepped up to help. "You've created something remarkable here," she told Sarah, watching as children from different grades worked together to set up a makeshift salad bar. "This isn't just a lunch program anymore, it's a lesson in community resilience." By noon, not only had they managed to feed every student at Riverside, but they had also sent hot meals to 2 other schools affected by the power outage. Parents took photos of their children serving food alongside grandparents and neighbors, capturing moments of intergenerational learning and cooperation. That evening, as the community gathered to clean up, someone suggested making it a regular event. Not the power outage part, they clarified with a laugh, but the community lunch. A monthly celebration where we all come together to share food and stories. The idea quickly gained momentum. Teachers saw it as an opportunity to integrate cultural studies and practical life skills into the curriculum. Local businesses offered to sponsor different months, providing resources and expertise. Even the high school's culinary arts program wanted to get involved, seeing a chance for their students to gain real-world experience. Sarah watched as people excitedly discussed possibilities, amazed at how a potential disaster had sparked yet another evolution in their program. Ryan tugged at her sleeve, his face serious. "Mom, remember when you were worried about taking this job? Look at what happened today, everybody helped everybody else. That's what you wanted all along, right?" She hugged him close, remembering the angry mother who had stormed into the cafeteria so many months ago. That moment of frustration had led to something far bigger than she could have imagined, a movement that continued to grow and adapt, drawing strength from the very challenges that threatened to derail it. The following week, Sarah presented a proposal to the school board for monthly community kitchen days across the district. The events would combine food sharing with educational workshops, cultural celebrations, and practical skills training. To her surprise, the board not only approved the idea but also allocated additional funding for kitchen equipment and safety training. Local media coverage of the power outage response brought new attention to the program. Other districts began reaching out, asking how they could build similar community connections. Sarah found herself conducting weekend workshops for educators and parents from neighboring counties, sharing not just their successes but also the lessons learned from their challenges. The winter continued to test their resourcefulness. Heavy snow forced school closures, but the community network they had built ensured that no child went hungry. Parents coordinated meal deliveries to families in need, and high school students earned community service credits by helping with distribution. One particularly cold afternoon, as Sarah helped load meals into volunteers' cars, she overheard 2 mothers talking. "Before all this, I barely knew my neighbors," one said. "Now I'm trading recipes with people from all over the district and learning about foods I never knew existed." The other mother nodded. "My kids used to be such picky eaters. Now they come home excited to tell me about the new dishes their friends shared at lunch. Last week, my youngest asked if we could try making sushi." These conversations reinforced what Sarah had always believed, that food could be more than just nutrition. It could be a bridge between cultures, a tool for learning, and a way to build lasting connections within a community. As she drove home that evening, Sarah thought about how their program had weathered its first major crisis. The power outage could have been a setback, but instead, it had revealed the true strength of what they had built together, a resilient network of people ready to support each other when needed. Ryan was unusually quiet during dinner, pushing his food around thoughtfully. Finally, he looked up. "Mom, do you think we could write a book about everything that's happened? So other schools could learn from our story?" Sarah smiled, reaching for her notebook. Perhaps that would be their next adventure, sharing their journey so that other communities could build their own versions of what they had created. After all, the best ideas were meant to be shared, just like the meals that had brought them all together. Spring brought a surprising invitation that would test the strength of their community initiative in ways no one could have anticipated. The Department of Education had selected their district as a potential model for a national school nutrition program, and officials from Washington would be visiting to evaluate their success. Sarah sat in her office, staring at the official letter. A year ago, she had been working double shifts at the diner, just trying to make ends meet. Now, their grassroots movement had caught the attention of national policymakers. The responsibility felt overwhelming. "We received some big news today," she told Ryan over dinner that evening. Their small kitchen table was set with a healthy stir-fry they'd prepared together, using vegetables from their community garden plot. "Is it about the people from Washington?" Ryan asked, surprising her. "Mrs. Thompson mentioned something at school. She said everyone's talking about it." News traveled fast in their tight-knit community. By the next morning, Sarah's phone was buzzing with messages from parents, teachers, and community partners, all offering to help prepare for the upcoming evaluation. The first planning meeting filled the school gymnasium. Families brought dishes to share, turning it into an impromptu potluck as they discussed how to showcase their program's impact. Children darted between the adults, proudly pointing out the dishes they had helped prepare. "We shouldn't do anything special," suggested one of the cafeteria workers. "Let them see a regular day, the real program in action. That's what makes us different." The suggestion resonated with everyone. Instead of staging elaborate presentations, they would simply open their doors and let the officials experience their daily routine. It was a brave choice, but Sarah knew it was the right one. As the visit approached, the natural rhythm of their program continued. The spring garden planting went ahead as scheduled, with students working alongside community volunteers to prepare the soil and sow seeds. Cooking classes and nutrition workshops carried on, now with the added excitement of students teaching their parents what they'd learned. The morning of the evaluation arrived with perfect spring weather. Sarah stood in the Riverside Elementary parking lot with Ryan, watching the officials' cars pull in. Her son squeezed her hand. "Remember when you taught me that being honest is more important than being perfect?" he whispered. The evaluation team consisted of 3 officials, each carrying tablets and wearing serious expressions. Sarah had prepared herself for formal presentations and rigid questioning. Instead, their lead evaluator, Dr. Rivera, asked something unexpected. "Can we follow a student through their normal day? We want to see how this program actually works in real life." Ryan volunteered immediately. "I can show them everything, Mom. Is that okay?" What followed was a day seen through the eyes of a child who had witnessed the program's evolution from the beginning. Ryan led them to his classroom's windowsill herb garden, explaining how they used the fresh herbs in cooking classes and science experiments. He showed them the cafeteria's sharing table, where students could exchange lunch items and ensure no food went to waste. During lunch, the officials watched as students confidently served themselves from the salad bar, discussing nutrients and portion sizes with natural ease. They observed children trading family recipes and stories, the cafeteria buzzing with engaged conversation rather than just hurried eating. "In my 40 years of education policy," Dr. Rivera commented, watching a group of students help younger ones navigate the lunch options, "I've never seen anything quite like this." The afternoon brought more surprises for the evaluation team. They sat in on a math class where students calculated food miles and carbon footprints. They visited the high school, where culinary students were teaching elementary kids about food science. At every turn, they saw how the program had woven itself into the fabric of daily learning. As the day drew to a close, the officials gathered in the conference room for their final assessment. The atmosphere was tense as Dr. Rivera cleared her throat to speak. "We came here expecting to evaluate a lunch program," she began. "Instead, we've witnessed something far more significant. You've created a model of community education that goes beyond nutrition. This is about building relationships, teaching life skills, and empowering children to make informed choices. The room held its breath as she continued. However, she paused, implementing this on a national scale would be challenging. Every community is unique. We can't simply copy and paste your success. Sarah's heart sank, but Dr. Rivera wasn't finished. What we can do is help other communities learn from your journey. We'd like to establish a pilot program, with your district as the mentor site. Would you be willing to help other schools build their own versions of what you've created here? The proposal was beyond anything they had imagined. It wasn't just validation of their work, it was an opportunity to help other communities find their own path to success. That evening, as the excitement died down and the last of the day's visitors departed, Sarah found herself back in the Riverside Elementary cafeteria. She stood in the spot where, months ago, she had confronted a teacher about throwing away her son's lunch. The space felt different now, filled with memories of community meetings, cooking classes, and countless shared meals. Ryan sat at one of the tables, doing his homework. "Mom," he called out, "remember when you said that sometimes the best way to fight for what's right is to find common ground?" She nodded, joining him at the table. "Well," he continued, "maybe that's what we can teach other schools. Not just about food, but about how to work together to make things better." Sarah pulled out her notebook, suddenly inspired. If they were going to help other communities, they would need to document their journey, not as a blueprint to follow, but as a story to inspire. She began to write, starting with that fateful day in the cafeteria, recording not just what they had done, but how they had learned and grown together as a community. Outside, the spring garden was beginning to bloom, tended by dozens of hands working in harmony. It was a living symbol of what they had created, something beautiful and nourishing, grown from the seeds of concern and care, fed by the rich soil of community involvement, and now ready to spread its seeds to new ground. The national pilot program brought new energy to their community initiative, but it also presented unexpected challenges. One morning, Sarah arrived at her office to find an email from a struggling school district in an urban area, expressing frustration with their attempts to replicate the program. "We don't have gardens. We don't have parents who can take time off work. We don't have local farmers," the email read. "How are we supposed to make this work?" The message weighed heavily on Sarah's mind as she drove to the monthly community council meeting. She remembered her own early struggles as a single working mother, how she'd pieced together healthy meals between shifts. The program needed to be flexible enough to work in any setting, with any resources. "We've got a situation," she announced to the gathered group. Ryan sat in his usual spot near the window, homework spread across the table in front of him. He looked up, recognizing the tone in his mother's voice, the one that meant a new challenge was coming. Mrs. Thompson raised her hand before Sarah could continue. "Actually, we might have something that could help." She explained that her class had been video chatting with a school in the city, sharing ideas about starting small classroom gardens in windowsills and undergrow lights. "The kids came up with it themselves," she added. "They've been teaching each other about different growing methods. Some of our students are even helping them design hydroponic systems for their science fair." Other council members began sharing similar stories. The high school robotics club was developing an app to help families find affordable, healthy food options in their neighborhoods. Local businesses had started a virtual mentorship program, connecting with schools across the country to share expertise about food service and nutrition. "Maybe that's the key," Sarah realized aloud. "We're not trying to clone our program, we're helping each community discover their own strengths and resources." The council spent the next several hours brainstorming ways to make the program more adaptable. They created online training modules, virtual cooking classes, and a network where schools could share their successes and challenges. Ryan suggested adding a kids section to their website, where students could connect and share ideas directly. Weeks passed as they worked to implement these new initiatives. Sarah spent evenings on video calls with schools across the country, listening to their unique situations and helping them find creative solutions. Some schools turned empty classrooms into indoor gardens. Others partnered with local food banks to create weekend nutrition programs. One evening, as Sarah reviewed progress reports from various pilot sites, Ryan burst into her office, excitement written all over his face. "Mom, you need to see this." He pulled up a video on his tablet, showing students from an inner-city school giving a virtual tour of their new rooftop garden. "Remember that school that emailed you? The one that said they couldn't do it?" He grinned. "Look what they did instead." The video showed how the school had transformed their barren rooftop into a thriving garden space. Students had built planters from recycled materials, rigged up rain collection systems, and created a composting program. They'd even started a small butterfly garden, attracting pollinators to their urban oasis. "They didn't copy us," Ryan observed. "They made something even better for their school." Sarah watched as more success stories poured in from pilot schools. A rural community had started a mobile farmers market, bringing fresh produce to food deserts. An urban school had partnered with local restaurants to create apprenticeship programs for high school students. Each location had taken the basic framework of their program and adapted it to fit their unique circumstances. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story titled, "From Local Lunch Revolution to National Movement." The article featured interviews with parents and teachers from across the country, each sharing how they'd transformed their school's approach to nutrition and community engagement. During a district-wide celebration marking the first anniversary of their program, Sarah found herself back in the Riverside Elementary cafeteria. The space had been decorated with photos showing the program's evolution, from that first confrontation to the current national initiative. "Look at this one," Ryan said, pointing to a picture of their first community garden planting day. "Remember how worried everyone was that nothing would grow?" Sarah smiled, remembering the uncertainty of those early days. Now, their original garden had inspired hundreds of others, each unique but growing from the same seeds of community involvement and care for children's well-being. The celebration turned into an impromptu planning session as people shared ideas for the program's future. A group of middle school students presented their proposal for a youth advisory board to help guide the program's development. High school seniors talked about their plans to start similar initiatives in their future colleges. Later that evening, as Sarah and Ryan walked home through their neighborhood, they passed several front yard gardens that had sprung up in the wake of their school program. Neighbors waved from their porches, some offering fresh vegetables from their own plots. "Mom," Ryan said thoughtfully, "remember when you said that real change doesn't happen overnight?" Sarah nodded, thinking of all the small steps that had led them to this point. "Well, it's kind of like planting a garden, isn't it? You have to prepare the soil, plant the seeds, and then take care of them every day. But once things start growing, they spread on their own." His words captured perfectly what their program had become, not just a set of guidelines to follow, but a movement that grew and adapted naturally, taking root in different ways in different places. The next morning, Sarah began drafting a response to a new email from another interested school district. Instead of sending them a detailed plan to follow, she asked them a simple question: "What makes your community special, and how can we help you build something that works for you?" As she hit send, she smiled, knowing that somewhere, another seed of change was about to be planted, ready to grow in its own unique way. 2 years had passed since that pivotal day in the school cafeteria. Sarah stood at the podium of a national education conference, looking out at hundreds of faces from across the country. Behind her, a slideshow displayed images of school gardens, community kitchens, and students engaged in various food-related learning activities. "When I walked into my son's school cafeteria that day," she began, "I was just a concerned mother. I never imagined that moment would spark a movement that would touch so many lives." The audience included many familiar faces, educators, parents, and students from the pilot program schools. Each had their own story of transformation, their own version of what had started at Riverside Elementary. In the front row, Ryan sat with a group of student ambassadors from different schools. Now 11, he had grown into a confident advocate for healthy eating and community engagement. He and his fellow ambassadors had just finished presenting their own session on student-led initiatives. The real success of this program, Sarah continued, isn't in the numbers, though they're impressive. It's not in the improved test scores or attendance rates, though we've seen those too. The real success is in the connections we've built, the barriers we've broken down, and the communities we've strengthened. She shared stories from across the country, a school in Alaska that had built a greenhouse where elders taught traditional food preservation methods. An inner-city school that had transformed an abandoned lot into a community garden and outdoor classroom. A rural school that had created a mobile teaching kitchen to serve remote areas. After the presentation, Sarah found herself surrounded by people eager to share their experiences. A grandmother from Texas described how the program had helped her reconnect with her grandchildren through cooking traditional family recipes. A teenager from Michigan proudly showed photos of the rooftop beehiving project she had started at her high school. Mrs. Miller, a young teacher, approached with tears in her eyes. "I was about to quit teaching before our school joined the program. Now, my classroom is alive with learning. Students who never participated before are leading projects. Parents who never came to school events are regular volunteers." As the conference wound down, Sarah received news that would take their initiative in yet another unexpected direction. The United Nations had taken notice of their success and wanted to explore implementing similar programs in schools worldwide. That evening, Sarah and Ryan sat in their hotel room, sharing a healthy dinner they had prepared in the small kitchenette. "Mom," Ryan said, pushing his plate aside, "remember when you used to worry about making healthy lunches on a tight budget?" Sarah nodded, thinking back to those challenging days. "Now you're helping people all over the world do the same thing," he continued. "But you know what's really cool? Everyone's doing it differently, but they're all doing it together." The next morning, as they packed to return home, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. It was a video from Mrs. Thompson's class back at Riverside Elementary. The students had created a surprise for her, a documentary about how their school had changed over the past 2 years. The video showed interviews with students, parents, and teachers. It captured moments from their community gardens, cooking classes, and cultural celebrations. But most touching were the simple scenes of everyday lunch periods, students sharing meals, telling stories, and building friendships across cultural and social boundaries. Back home, Sarah found a thick envelope in her mailbox. Inside were letters from schools around the country, each sharing their unique journey of transformation. One principal wrote about how discipline problems had decreased since they started their gardening program. A school nurse reported fewer cases of nutrition-related health issues. A cafeteria worker described how she had rediscovered her passion for cooking. As she read through the letters, Sarah reflected on how their program had evolved. What began as a mother's protest against wasted food had grown into something far more significant, a movement that empowered communities to come together and create positive change. That weekend, during their regular community garden workday, Sarah watched as new families joined longtime volunteers in tending the expanding plots. Children taught their parents about composting while grandparents shared stories of traditional farming methods. The garden had become more than just a source of fresh produce, it was a living classroom, a community gathering space, and a symbol of what was possible when people worked together. Ryan worked alongside his friends, showing younger children how to identify ripe vegetables and explaining the importance of beneficial insects. He had grown so much, not just in height but in his understanding of how small actions could lead to big changes. As the sun began to set, the community gathered for their monthly harvest dinner. Tables were laden with dishes representing diverse culinary traditions, each with a story to tell. Sarah looked around at the faces illuminated by the evening light, faces that had become family over the past 2 years. "You know," Mrs. Chen said, settling into the chair beside her, "when you first stood up in that cafeteria, you were fighting for your son. But look at what you were really fighting for, the right of every child to grow up in a community that cares, that teaches, that nourishes both body and soul. Sarah squeezed the elderly woman's hand, thinking about the journey ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new schools to help, new communities to connect with. But she knew now that they weren't just building a program, they were nurturing a movement that would continue to grow and adapt, one meal, one garden, one community at a time. As the evening drew to a close, Ryan appeared at her side with a notebook in hand. "Mom, I've been thinking about our next project," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "What if we?" Sarah smiled, ready to embrace whatever new adventure lay ahead. After all, the most beautiful gardens were the ones that kept growing, season after season, nourished by the care and dedication of many hands working together.